Oh, hey, how's it going? I was just out on a supply run. It's been a while, hasn't it? I've been stuck in here because of the thing, you know. You don't know about the thing? How do you not know?
El Colosso, painted by Francisco de Goya sometime after 1808, depicts an enormous man, a giant, a colossus, towering over a valley as people, cattle and horses, covered wagons and riders rush across the landscape in flurries of panic, clearly fleeing, although without any cohesive sense of direction. The cyclopean figure's presence on the horizon hasn't simply driven a stampede, but induced chaotic abandon. Goya's lifelong transition from realism to magical realism allowed his paintings to develop an increasing capacity to evoke something deeper than simple representational scenes. If these cattle were running away from a fire or distant explosions, it would fail to create the same sense we feel of something impossibly large, dominating our understanding of the world around us.
Critics have understood the Colossus, who appeared several times throughout Goya's works, to function as a visual metaphor for the mood of Spain during the Peninsular War, his developing postures between works and his shifting expressions contributing to a seemingly animate, mobile subject beyond the physicality of the frame, the series of works aligning with the popular energy of Spain at the time. There is, though, something compellingly universal about the Colossus. My name is Sophie. Welcome to Monster Men, a series about monster stories, what they mean, why we tell them, and where they come from. Now, I've called this essay Kaiju to evoke a certain kind of monster, and even a certain king of monsters in particular. But I don't want to lose sight of the men part of Monster Men here. This is a series about monster stories, but at the heart of all monster stories is something very interesting about how human beings behave. The word monstrous has two common meanings: cruel, horrible, terrible, unthinkable, and just plain fucking big. I've called this essay Kaiju, although we'll play around with what counts as a kaiju, because I want to talk about what it means when we tell stories about really big monsters. Monstrous, however, and the word monster for that matter, derive from a root that means to show, hence demonstrate. A monster is a portent, a warning, a sign of something. A monster is big, a monster is scary, but a monster is also a way of depicting something, a way of understanding something. Your boy, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, famously said there are decades where nothing happens and weeks where decades happen. And I don't know about you, but it does feel a little bit like we're living through a decade of weeks where decades happen. And in a time like ours, where big things keep happening on a societal scale, to the point where crisis feels almost like its own perverse continuity, it can be easier for the human brain to understand big things happening if it's put in the terms of a single huge lad just ripping the piss out of the city you live in. So let's not mess around and start with the classic huge lad. Godzilla, a representation of the atomic bomb.
The original kaiju film Gojira 1954, rather than focusing solely on the king of monsters himself, spends an enormous amount of time showing the consequences of the monster. The fire, the collapsing buildings, the people screaming in anguish as their loved ones are thoughtlessly destroyed. Watching the film, seeing the now very dated effects, it bolsters what I've seen many people draw as a conclusion, that the filmmakers wanted to avoid showing the very obvious guy in a rubber suit monster too much. But how much of a reasonable conclusion is that? After all, the rest of the movie isn't just carnage, it has a plot that follows the people whose lives are being destroyed by the monster and the efforts to fight it. Even the carnage itself, which does make up a lot of the screen time, uses effects which require planning, expertise, resources, and materials. Still though, whole scenes and sequences divert our attention away from Gojira in a movie ostensibly about Gojira, which is called Gojira, to instead linger on the catastrophic human toll. It's as though the movie wants us to engage in a more holistic understanding of what Gojira means. Gojira isn't just the big lizard, Gojira is the devastation, the destruction, the consequences. Any idea that the film wants to avoid accusations of schlock become quite thin and flimsy. The genre that this film spawned, after all, is ripe to bursting, both with movies where guy-in-costume monsters get a deeply unfortunate amount of screen time, and films where the monster is the only captivating part and the rest is sheer tedium.
What sets Gojira apart, what makes it such a classic, why so many others tried to imitate it, is the epistemological approach of the film itself. Developing the idea of giant as literary tool, it imparts an understanding that brings out the deeper horror of the story. The giant and its consequences cannot be meaningfully separated. The nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki may have been approved by politicians, planned by generals, executed by soldiers, but to the millions dead and injured, to the people working in rescue and recovery, to the nation in mourning, the internal thoughts and machinations of the American war machine matter far less than what comes next. Gojira captures all too perfectly the exclusively post-facto nature of cataclysm. The Colossus isn't evil because something that big can't possess the rationality that underpins the nature of evil. Let's refine things here before we get our wires crossed. The dropping of the bomb, the act, the intention, especially the dropping of a second one, in a world that already contained the observable and unfolding consequences of the first, that is evil. What the giant does for the story, however, for the representation of the atomic bomb, is create narrative space for the people who were hurt away from the willfully evil decision to hurt them. The victims of the atrocity are allowed space without needing to find the moral weight of the people who did this to them. The movie ends when Gojira's body sinks to the bottom of the ocean. Nothing more needs to be said.
Similarly, 2008 film Cloverfield created space for Americans to engage with the horror of the September 11th attacks through the lens of a big monster destroying New York. The film famously utilizes shaky, unprofessional, and ramshackle mobile phone and home video footage to reflect the piecemeal impression of the event that Americans had at the time, from random snippets of footage, and the way that the camera loses track of people communicates the very real terror and confusion of people not knowing where their loved ones were as thousands were dying and buildings were collapsing around them. People appear and disappear, and we don't know if any of them are alive if they aren't currently on screen. In a very tangible sense, Cloverfield deals with 9/11 for an American audience in the same way that Godzilla allowed Japanese audiences to consider the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The question of the agency and intentionality of the perpetrator is entirely removed. The only thing that exists, the only thing that matters, is the monster and its consequences.
This, I think, is particularly interesting considering the long-term political effects of 9/11 on America, the short-term and ongoing long-term Islamophobia and its association with American patriotism. We could say Americans were broadly divided between two reactions to 9/11. The first reaction saw part of the population wondering why someone would do that, how someone could hate America so much and so viscerally as to want to kill thousands of people. This led them on to an interrogation of America's role on the global stage, the anti-war movement, and in many ways the modern American left. The second reaction was to say, I don't care why someone would do that. I just want them to hurt too. The existence of a reasoning and motivation behind mass death allows for a conflict between people who want to interpret and assess it and people who simply want revenge. And I think it's fair to say that the senseless violence of giant monsters in giant monster movies is all the better for being senseless. The audience can find a common solace in simply mourning the dead, simply hating the monster, simply sitting in the tragedy. Slavoj Žižek once called 9/11 the ultimate artistic expression of a passion for the real, by which he meant that for many politically unconscious liberals living in the supposed end of history, the attacks were a violent awakening to the fact that history was very much still going on and couldn't be escaped. I think this idea of 9/11 as a kind of performance, quite besides Žižek's usual flippant and contrarian way of framing things, is unhelpful because it misses the monster for the monstrosity. The terror, the shock and horror caused and intended by the attacks wasn't like the cultural reception to a piece of performance art. There was no discrete performance and then discussion and afterthought. The response in culture and governmental policy wasn't simply that of a nation startled by a frightening apparition. The giant and its consequences cannot be meaningfully separated. Now, kaiju in Japanese means strange beast, and I think people expect that. They don't expect a kaiju to just be a large version of a real animal, in the way that Godzilla isn't just a large lizard. Gojira is actually a portmanteau of gorilla and the Japanese word for whale. But Before we get really wacky and just start straight up describing giant humans as part of the kaiju tradition, I do think there's a whole pantheon of kaiju that usually aren't acknowledged for the strange beasts that they are.
H.P. Lovecraft's monsters are always strange. They're usually described by the author, who was very good at ambiance but not very good at evoking visual imagery, and other authors aping his style, as combinations of existing animals. Cthulhu, the most famous Lovecraftian monster, is a squid on a man's torso with bat wings and the legs and tail of a dragon. I know that's not really what Cthulhu looks like, don't fucking at me, you pedants, but the point is, being chimeric, beastly, terrifying, and huge, Lovecraftian monsters fit actually very neatly into the world of kaiju. Lovecraft was a hermit and shut-in for most of his life, and absolutely terrified of everything outside his house, so when we talk about big monsters representing big things in the world, it isn't too surprising that old HPL wrote a lot of stories about enormous monsters. He sadly didn't have much particularly incisive commentary to offer with his big monsters because, again, he didn't have much of a clue what the fuck was going on outside his front door, but the sense of a universe full of monstrous forces that could ruin your mind and body and soul without even blinking set a lot of writers on a path to telling what I think a lot of people agree are better stories. So, while Lovecraft's own stories aren't that interesting to analyze for the meanings of giant monsters, stories inspired by Lovecraft often are. Mike Mignola, creator of Hellboy, often plays with giant monsters in a way that's obviously Lovecraft-inspired. Mignola's most famous works are Hellboy, in which the titular hero Hellboy travels the world, discovering its various occult secret realms and wrestling with his destiny and role in the world, and The BPRD, a Hellboy universe series about various characters within the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense. His heroes are often big guys, not giants per se, but larger than normal. Hellboy is a big guy with a big punchy fist that he uses to fight often much bigger guys. In the 2000s, with the knock-on effects of the September 11th attacks having transformed American politics, with the introduction of the DHS, the ramping up of the security state, the events of the BPRD series showed a sort of supernatural mirror of contemporary American life. Fungal bioweapons transform unsuspecting citizens into frog monsters, occultist doomsday cults emerge as giants crawl out of the earth and destroy cities, and immortal Nazis try to seize power in the emerging hell world. The real-life release of the comics between the chaos of 9/11 and the dread of the worsening climate crisis is pretty easy to track in the stories of the comics themselves, with the BPRD itself receiving blank check funding from the US government as more and more paranormal bullshit unfolds. This kind of cosmic horror with a very political bent comes naturally enough from Mignola, whose two biggest inspirations have clearly always been H.P. Lovecraft and Francisco de Goya. Mignola's stories don't always focus on giant monsters explicitly, but there's always the sense that there's something under the surface, just about ready to erupt into apocalyptic mayhem, and his heroes, while by no means giants themselves, are often larger than life, physically powerful fighters with only blunt tools at their disposal. His stories are always about the bigger forces not immediately perceptible to the naked eye. Hellboy's two weapons of choice are a comically oversized hand cannon and his sledgehammer-like stone right hand, but as his story develops we learn that he is the descendant and heir of both King Arthur on his mother's side and Satan. He's also the adopted son of the head of the BPRD, which obviously doesn't give him a hereditary role, but makes him very significant in the organization, and gives the reader an ongoing sense that maybe at some point he could return and lead them all to victory, though he probably never will. Hellboy's great potential destinies weigh heavily on him throughout his arc, as he sees that being big and powerful doesn't solve his problems. On the contrary, the more responsibility he's given, the more easily it seems he can unintentionally hurt innocent people.
I really think that giant monsters or not, though there frequently are giant monsters, Mike Mignola is one of the best writers of giant myths currently working today.
Another incredible Lovecraft-adjacent monster story is the McManus Brothers Netflix movie, The Block Island Sound. The monster of the film is never shown on screen, but its effects are enormous, and the ways that it messes with the central characters make them seem tiny and insignificant, with the film comparing the human beings the plot revolves around to helpless fish being studied for environmental research. The movie is about Harry, a man on Block Island, about an hour's boat ride from Narragansett, Rhode Island. Harry's dad is seemingly suffering from a neurodegenerative illness and keeps waking up with no memory of what he's done or disappearing without telling anyone. Harry's sister Audrey comes to the island on behalf of the EPA because scores of fish keep washing up dead, and while she's visiting, their dad disappears, and later his body also washes up on the shore. After this, Harry starts experiencing the same symptoms as his dad, and we slowly realize that something in the water is somehow controlling Harry, making him sick and desperate and luring him out into the open ocean. The movie leaves us with Audrey's explanation to her daughter that the EPA has to take some fish to study them so it can understand all the fish better.
We're learning about them. We're studying them so we can get to know them better. So we can help them better.
The tension throughout the film between the small town, or small island I suppose, thinking of the Block Island residents, and the mainland visitors isn't seen from Audrey, who might seem the natural stepping stone character, but rather from Harry, whose mind is rapidly deteriorating. It doesn't make rational arguments for a mistrust of the government, but rather emotional arguments for how the government and government bodies make people feel studied, like marine life for environmental research. Even if the research is important and overall beneficial, the imperceptible nature of the big thing that can so easily uproot and interfere with people is scary.
The Block Island Sound became one of my favourite horror movies as soon as I saw it, and I think it really helped me to understand H.P. Lovecraft and Lovecraftian horror better. As I said before, Lovecraft's stories utilize big monsters and unknowable forces because Lovecraft himself didn't know much about the outside world and was terrified of it. But I think there's something very human about his mistrust and fear of enormous forces outside his control. There might be entirely good, rational, and scientific reasons for the existence of, say, the EPA. But to fishermen who rely on fishing to live, even if they understand it, its power and its presence can be scary. We live in a big world with big things in it, and we don't get any say over what those big things do to us. It's probably obvious I'm bouncing around a little talking about kaiju stories, and that's because ultimately it's still a genre that's very pulpy and full of egregious schlock. Very few kaiju stories stand the test of time, despite the potential for thoughtful and meaningful storytelling. I think that to understand the nature of giant monsters better, we need to think more about giants. So we need to go back further and look at stories that have already stood the test of time by being passed down from generation to generation.
There are many tales of giants in these old isles, especially up in the north with the hills. Sometimes people look at them and they say they look like sleeping giants. There's a great story actually about the Wrekin Hill out by Telford. The Wrekin used to be a giant, and one day this giant was on his way to Shrewsbury to just fuck up Shrewsbury. I don't know why. No one knows why, but understandable really. And he was on his way to Shrewsbury with a giant-sized shovel and a giant pile of dirt to just fuck their shit completely. And he got a bit lost when he got to Telford and was looking around, and he saw a cobbler coming the other way. The cobbler's just been in Shrewsbury getting people's shoes. Shrewsbury, if you will. Had some customers there, some clients, some friends. He had his big sack full of leather shoes he was going to repair and swap the parts out and whatever. And he sees this big giant who asks him the way to Shrewsbury, and being a shrewd sort, Shrewsbury if you will, thinks, I've got a lot of customers and friends and clients in Shrewsbury. I don't like the look of this big angry giant looking for Shrewsbury. And he says, I do know where Shrewsbury is, yeah actually, but it's quite far from here. It's not. And if you get all the way there, and I've noticed you're not wearing any shoes, and you wipe Shrewsbury off the map with that big giant pile of dirt and that big giant-sized shovel, and understandable, to be clear, you absolutely should. But if you get all the way there and your feet are all cut up from walking a long way, won't Shrewsbury have won, really? You don't want that. And the giant agrees, and the cobbler offers to make him some shoes, but it's going to take a while on account of his giant feet. So the Rican sits down, and they get to chatting, presumably about how much they hate Shrewsbury, I guess. And the Rican gets really sleepy, and lies down, and falls asleep. Has a little nap. A snoozeberry, in fact. And the Rican becomes a mountain, and ever since, the Rican lies there. But one day, he might wake up, and if he does, it's over for the people of Shrewsbury.
There are tons of myths about giants being an essential part of the formation of the landscape. It's quite common and often theorised that giants of old British folklore should be understood as the original inhabitants of the land, the reason that the large features of the land got where they are. Geoffrey of Monmouth, for example, wrote in The History of the Kings of Britain, a sort of fictionalised folkloric history of Britain, that at first Britain was entirely populated by giants, before the mythic founding kings arrived and killed them all to make it safe for people. However, I think there's something pretty essential about the character of these giants that we're ignoring if we just think of them that way. Even in Geoffrey of Monmouth's telling, after all, there's something very political going on with the giants if they represent a sort of native element of the land that has to be conquered and defeated for the sake of human life. Giants are almost always aggressive and destructive, to the point where the term gentle giant is a conscious deviation from the norm. A giant is so big that it can't help but tear through the landscape, carelessly treading on things, buildings, people, unless it's a special, gentle giant, in which case it considers its actions carefully and avoids such natural chaos in its wake. In the case of Geoffrey of Monmouth and the native giants of Britain, there's something in the idea that these enormous wild brutes used to roam free until the noble and valiant kings came to tame them. Old Jeff was a cleric responsible for a lot of the spread of the myths of King Arthur, and needless to say, a devout monarchist, and his perspective on history clearly set the aristocracy as the heroes of the human struggle. Moreover, the popular myths of giants that evolve out of telling and retelling, the stories from the naturally opposite side of the coin from Geoffrey's perspective, often paint giants as capable of reasoning, speaking, understanding, and so on, but stubborn to the point of stupidity, greedy, obtuse, and obstinate.
I want to tell you about Jack the Giant Killer, but there's some context you need to know first. See, there's a bit of an age-old mythic accumulation and occupation between England and Wales, a bit of a pre-medieval info war. You see, the Welsh use a red dragon as their national symbol, and this kind of comes from a myth that has to do with like a red dragon and a white dragon fighting each other, very, the Welsh and the English. And the English actually chose St. George as a symbol because he slew a red dragon, not just because they thought that was neat or whatever, but because it was their symbol of like suppressing Wales. And another Welsh national myth is King Arthur. People think that King Arthur is the symbol of England, the once and future king of all Britons, but actually, originally King Arthur is Welsh, and not just Welsh, but is this Welsh national symbol, and the idea of King Arthur going to sleep and the idea that he may one day come back is a symbol of some pride and hope for Welsh nationalists, to the point where hundreds of years ago, English aristos, would stage funerals and like fake executions and whatever of King Arthur so that they could say to the Welsh, he's not coming back. He's gone now. Stop hoping for him to come back. So it's worth bearing in mind that King Arthur was originally actually Welsh, and Jack the Giant Killer in Arthurian legend is actually King Arthur's cousin. So it's possible that Jack comes from a Welsh myth, although some people attribute it to Cornwall. There's also a storied history between the Cornish and the English, and the Cornish and the Welsh for that matter. But one way or another, Jack is somewhat of a folk hero, a symbol of liberation. And Jack is this person who slew giants. Usually giants who were extracting some kind of rent, taking livestock or women or gold. Two giants at one point in the story of Jack the Giant Killer even kidnap him and take him to their palace where they live, because they live in palaces. So the first story of Jack the Giant Killer is the story of Cormoran. Cormoran was terrorizing the local people, taking their livestock, and he lived in this cave nearby. And Jack came by one day. He's this skinny little twink, and he's like, I can fix your giant problem. And they're all like, go on, no you can't. Jack's like, I can, and all I need is a sword and a shovel and a bugle. And they're like, this guy's, he's a beanpole, he's not going to do anything. And he keeps on saying he can, and maybe they're just sick of him. They're like, here's the stuff, go on, just sod off. And he takes the sword and the shovel and the bugle, and he goes to outside Cormoran's cave, and he digs this big, deep trench right outside. And he starts playing the bugle really early in the morning, just before the crack of dawn. And at first it wakes Cormoran up. Maybe he tries to go back to sleep. And then Jack plays the bugle more in an iconic, irritating twink moment. And Cormoran starts yelling for him to piss off, and Jack keeps on going with the bugle, and Cormoran gets up and he rushes out and falls in the trench, which is so deep that the giant's head is all that's poking above the ground. And then Jack just jumps on his head and stabs him and kills him. Now, I find it quite relevant that Cornish or Welsh, Jack is a folk hero from places where they have a bit more of an extreme terrain for people who were oppressed by the English. And people are telling the story of this folk hero using the terrain against an impossibly strong foe in a way that makes it easy to defeat him, irritate him, and draw him into this trench where he can be slain.
It's worth making further distinctions about English, Welsh, and Brittonic mythology, because the English have no culture, are clapped, and are cancelled. No, in all seriousness, the modern conception of what English culture and English myths are was almost entirely constructed post hoc by, well, one kind of awful fascist or another. It's a point of much discussion, frustration, and curiosity that we don't really have old sources for the culture of England before the Normans, and lots of things that are seen as very English, like King Arthur, actually come from Brittonic peoples that the English sought to oppress and destroy. Geoffrey of Monmouth was writing the history of the kings of Britain at a time when the Welsh were still very actively resisting invasion by the English, and the transformation of King Arthur from a Welsh national hero into an English one was an act of quite willful informational warfare. He was stealing King Arthur from the Welsh.
As it happens, Arthur was actually described like a giant in some of the Brittonic versions of the myths as well. It's very common that fictionalized historic figures who represent a sort of group identity become bigger and more physically powerful in retellings of their stories. In some of the oldest civilizations on record, the earliest gods were just semi-historic kings or queens who were seen as representative of a kingdom or a city-state who were described as stronger and bigger than ordinary people, perhaps also possessing magical powers. Of course, in the French court romances and more modern versions of Arthuriana, Arthur is a pretty normal, not to say normal-sized king, but to the Welsh he was often larger than life in correspondence with his socio-political significance.
We're going to dive further into these myths now and examine some of the common themes that pop up throughout giant stories, but before we do, I think it's really important to reaffirm the Monster Men series' commitment to avoiding syncretism. Stories do not come from one common source, nor do they contain one singular hidden meaning. For example, in a lot of Brittonic myths, there are loads of giants who are basically just dudes. Besides their unusual size, there's nothing particularly giant about them. They don't steal livestock, they don't say fee fi fo fum, they are just guys who happen to be really big. Part of that is because there's a sense that the people to whose culture those stories belonged were descended from giants, that being a giant used to be a normal thing that was just part of everyday life, and at some point over time, it just disappeared. What's interesting about stories falling into a common framework, or being comprehensible with the same sets of ideas, isn't that it hints at a secret conspiracy of human culture, but that the similar cultural conditions can produce stories that we can interpret using the same tools. Culture is not a monolith, but rather comprises the infinitesimal actions of individuals. So when people tell and retell stories that feel real and true to them, they mirror the socio-political moment those individuals live in, and so map onto real things about the real world in a delightfully messy and complicated way.
There was a sense in Brittonic myths, not so much the point of any stories, but just a feature of the culture, that giants shaped the earth by dying or going to sleep, like the Wrekin. So when we live, we come from the earth, and when we die, we return to it. When Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote that the noble kings of England had slain the giants, it was a mirror of the eradication of indigenous culture by the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans, but for Geoffrey, who grew up on the Welsh border with these myths, it was also a way of representing the Welsh and Brittonic understanding of their connection to the land. It's a double-edged sword, because it's portraying the slaying of the giants as good and necessary as a part of history, but also a noble, savage kind of idolization of the older mythology. Because of this idea, which is present in a lot of cultures, that giants are a part of our ancient ancestry, and because of the mechanism that I mentioned earlier by which historic figures get bigger and stronger and turn into giants in retellings of stories, it can sometimes come together that giants play a role in the fundamental construction of the mythic universe itself, but also have a complex relationship to power and politics. While the original Greek Titans were part of a myth of primordial formation, starting with the heaven and the earth having children who were the Titans, each representing ethereal concepts like time or memory, and then those Titans being overthrown by the Olympians, there's something even in their stories that can easily be understood through the lens of ruling people. Cronus, the leader of the first Titans and son of the sky and the earth, learned from his parents that he was one day going to be overthrown by one of his children, and because of this he began to devour every one of his children as soon as they were born, so they'd never have the chance to kill him. It was only because his sixth child, Zeus, was hidden from him at birth that Zeus grew to be big enough to eventually overthrow Cronus.
If we were to imagine, just for a minute, for fun, why not, that the story of Cronus had something to offer to do with stateship and kingship and the ruling class. Maybe what it would say to us is that being in charge, the things you have to do to remain in charge, are deeply inhuman and require the creation of this brutal, cruel thing, so evil that it cannot reasonably be expected to reckon with its own actions or existence.
I wouldn't be the first to notice this, of course. Peter Paul Rubens has depicted Cronus devouring one of his children in a painting titled Cronus devouring one of his children, and it really is a distressing scene, the poor, helpless infant being ripped at by the old man, seemingly almost devoid of any feelings or personality, the task of slaughter routine and meaningless as he does what he has to do to stay in charge, his humanity, if it was ever there, reduced to nil by the brutality he has to embody. This painting, one might think, is the zenith of this story's telling, the most human connection to the suffering of this harrowing myth.
One might think that if one was a swine and a hog who had never heard of fucking art before.
You see, the absolute fucking goat Francisco de Goya also took a little crack at depicting the Titan cannibalizing his own children, and he did it in his infamous Black Paintings, a series he created during his retirement in a community for deaf people, secluded and presumably reflecting on his life during which he had seen war, starvation, the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition. He painted the Black Paintings on the walls of his home, and that's when he created Saturn devouring his son. Goya's paintings transitioned across his career from depicting the scenes of turmoil and suffering in Spain to using magical realism to depict them through story and metaphor, but they always remained very angry works of art. The way that he saw the Spanish state cannibalize its own population to stay in power stuck with him his whole life, and it's chilling to imagine the old man Goya sitting in his dining room where he painted Saturn devouring his son, looking at the eyes of the Titan, tormented by the eternal horror of having to devour his own children to dodge the fate of prophecy. The child doesn't even have a face or a head. The entire painting is about Saturn and the unthinkable horror of his situation. All of this relates back to how we think about kaiju movies, the modern giant myths. Arguably, the best Godzilla film, Hideaki Anno's Shin Godzilla, depicts the giant as an evolving terror. At first, Godzilla is like a giant tadpole, just a head and a tail in the ocean, but as it moves in towards the land, causing devastation in its wake, it grows and develops more features. Throughout the film, we see incredible shots that don't necessarily remove the monster, but show us the consequences in a way that make it clearer what the monster is supposed to evoke. People run screaming down a crowded intersection. Shingles vibrate off a roof as Godzilla passes nearby. We can't help but understand Godzilla first as a tidal wave, then as a seismic event, then as a nuclear meltdown. The human reaction is so much more in the state infrastructure response as well. We see a city in life or death struggle with a disaster. The city doesn't use bombs and guns and missiles to defeat Godzilla, it uses trains and supply chains and concrete mixers. The nature of the metaphor evolves just as the monster physically transforms. Is Godzilla a tidal wave? No. Is it an earthquake? No. Is it a nuclear power station in meltdown? No. Godzilla is all of these things, and none of them, because Godzilla is itself the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster.
This relates to a piece of modern philosophy which... This relates to a piece of modern philosophy which could help us understand kaiju stories a little better. Godzilla is what Timothy Bloxham Morton would call a hyperobject. Hyperobjects, unlike regular objects, are things so large that they evade immediate perception. The atom bomb was an object. It had physical limitations and was immediately perceptible, but the atom bombing was and still is a hyperobject. The decision to drop the bomb can barely be figured into an understanding of the thing itself because the bombing is such a vast and complex entity with such far-reaching and adhesive qualities that it exists in the world like a giant, unthinking and amnesiac, inseparable from its consequences. 9/11 likewise now exists as a hyperobject, its tendrils snaking into practically every facet of modern American politics. This is another really important feature of the hyperobject, its adhesiveness. Everything touched by a hyperobject becomes part of it.
The regularly cited example is climate change. If we imagine you ordering something online, you are a person with microplastics in your bloodstream, using a computer full of rare earth minerals mined with ecologically devastating practices, using electricity that more likely than not comes from fossil fuels to order something that will have to be shipped to you, creating further emissions. Everything involved in that scene is climate change in one way or another. In the original planning for Shin Godzilla, the monster was going to, at one point, leak acidic blood which would rain down onto the streets and pop car tires. Now, this is an unused concept from many storyboards of Godzilla films, but Godzilla's blood has been at various times acidic or even radioactive, with plans in storyboards to show citizens choking to death as the blood rained down on them. Now, this was dropped from the film, and obviously, we could say it's a cut-and-dry allegory for radiation sickness, but understanding Godzilla as a hyper-objective monster, this communicates the adhesiveness of hyper-objects really well. When you touch Godzilla, you become Godzilla.
2 hours? And it did all this?
No. We did, wasting time with our response.
Kaiju movies at their best aren't just allegory for a disaster, but communicate the nature of hyperobjects through film by slightly altering the imperceptible hyperobject into a technically perceptible, but not immediately perceptible giant monster. You have to get really far away from Godzilla to see all of it, just like you need to look at so much global data to understand climate change, even where its effects can be immediately obvious. So, now that we have a good understanding of hyperobjects and kaiju as hyperobjective monsters, I want to get where this essay was always leading, perhaps the pinnacle of my media analysis career so far. I need to discuss one of the most politically important films of the last 100 years, Godzilla vs. King Kong. No, I'm really going to do a straight-faced socio-political analysis of a film whose central conceit is that the Hollow Earth is real and King Kong lives there. For those unfamiliar, King Kong vs. Godzilla is the fourth film in Legendary Pictures' MonsterVerse franchise, and it's about King Kong, big monkey, fighting Godzilla, big lizard. The film is a capitalist media product, more akin to a pro wrestling match than a classic work of art. It's a crossover event bringing two franchise mascots together to first battle and then resolve their differences to team up against a common enemy. Towards the end of the film, it is revealed that the state military contractor has manufactured a mechanical terror to defeat Godzilla, a robotic replica of the King of Monsters known as Mechagodzilla. Mechagodzilla immediately turns evil, and Kong and Godzilla have to work together to beat it, and then, with a newfound respect for Kong and by extension humanity, Godzilla returns to the sea. Again, the film is a popcorn flick, best enjoyed after exposure to your favourite substances and with little attention to the finer details, but in bringing together these franchise mascots, the filmmakers cannot avoid bringing in their metaphorical and subtextual contexts. You can't have Godzilla without Godzilla as metaphor for nuclear war, nuclear power, nature's wrath against humanity for introducing the horrors of nuclear energy to the world. You can't have King Kong without the context of Kong as a primate protector of the natural world, a sympathetic, gentle giant misunderstood by industrial Western imperialists. So when you make these giants fight each other, you are telling a story where humanity relies on a guardian who represents a return to nature and a synergy with the natural world against an enemy who represents the way the planet has become more hostile and inhospitable to us as a consequence of modern invention. When they then team up to defeat an abomination of the public-private partnership in military-industrial complex of the modern capitalist state, you aren't telling an apolitical story. As I hope I've made clear, I'm not above criticisms of the film, chief among them that they absolutely fucked up the size of Kong. Kong is not supposed to fight Godzilla on an equal footing. Kong is supposed to fight Godzilla as an underdog and use his cunning and wits, not just his muscles. They made the monkey too big. Monkey too big! But nonetheless, the film is telling a modern giant myth that has a real resonance with the world of giants we live in today. The hyper-objective monsters that dominate our imaginative landscape and our political life are at war, and we are, for the most part, just tiny spectators, our largest measure of agency to just try to form an alliance with the best monster we can pick. When the state tries to make a monster, it is immediately and inherently evil. Another giant of old Brittonic folklore, the Green Man, could fit into our modern giant myths and perhaps even the legendary Pictures monsterverse quite easily. The Green Man, a giant with a face of leaves, is a symbol of the natural world and the cycle of rebirth and renewal. He walks through the world and everything he touches blossoms and turns green. In an obvious sense, the Green Man is a hyper-objective figure of nature itself, his adhesive power of renewal, an almost perfect inversion of Shin Godzilla's radioactive blood. I'm not asking for a legendary Pictures Green Man movie. In fact, I would fucking hate that. But I would like the giant myths we tell today to have more gentle giants, because we need to appreciate that not all hyper-objects are there to be feared. We should tell stories about the good giants who struggle for something better, and perhaps give people a giant of nature, a giant of humanity, a giant of our connection to one another and the earth to believe in. To get current, I've been writing and researching this essay for over a year now, and I do feel a bit sad to be moving on from it, as well as obviously satisfied for it to be done. I've been thinking for such a long time now about how we relate to big, big things. There's something very appealing and enchanting about imagining the perspective of a giant, feet on the ground, head in the clouds, moving over enormous distances in a single stride. It's not just a simple power fantasy or about imagining being more significant in the world, though. It's also about how much more of everything you take in from a bigger perspective. I think about it when I go up tall buildings. I think about it when I fly in planes. I think about it when I see pictures of the Earth from space. I'm aware that as a person with lots of people watching me, I have a bit of the experience of a giant in my real life. Like, with lots of people looking at me in a way that I cannot escape unless I go to lengths to keep my interactions and conversations private, people will want to express opinions and takes on basically everything that I do, thinking that because they are, as it were, small, that I can't see them. But I can, so should I pretend not to know they're there? Or should I try to explain myself to strangers in the hopes that I can make myself better understood? I imagine myself pretty quickly stumbling through the town, lashing out, trying to fix things but causing more damage than I can control or contain. Something that really stuck with me when I was talking to a friend who has a lot of academic expertise in the Welsh and Brittonic myths that I talked about here was something that she just said in passing. She said that Britons told stories about giants they were supposedly descended from because there was this sense that we used to be giants, but over time, we were made small. Their giants weren't rich and powerful. They were a symbol of connection to the earth and to each other. They were big because it was understood that their relationship to the world, both in input and output, was big. And when they died and their bodies returned to the earth was changed permanently. They didn't leave the world the same as they found it. and they were remembered by the people who came after them. The monsters that we live alongside now are deeply inhuman, and I think that human beings contain a sense that we have been made small. If not by these things, then at least by comparison to these huge things without mind, memory, or center. Capitalism, climate change, war, nuclear disasters, terror attacks, none of these things will ever be gentle giants. None of them will ever be capable of considering their actions or accounting for them, and they are all inseparable from their consequences. So we know that we need solutions to these giants that are terrorizing us, but we also know that we can't construct some kind of artificial monstrosity to fight for us, because once unleashed upon the world, who knows what it would do? Right now we need to understand that either we will find a sympathetic giant that already emerged organically in the world we live in, or else we will have to eat the terrible monster from the inside out. And then perhaps we can be the kind of people who get to shape the world by having connection and community and human richness.
We don't live in a fairy tale age of heroes. Nobody slays giants alone.
I'd like to thank Patty Taxon and Mel Stone, whose music I used in this video, as well as my partners and friends who helped me write this essay over the last year, with special shoutouts to Alice for telling me the Rican story, and Ella for chatting with me for hours and hours about the research on giant myths from around the UK. I'd also like to thank DJ Mule for helping me film the parts in the woods and the hills, all my patrons who make everything I do possible, and you, the viewer, for watching all the way to the end. I've been away for a bit, as many of you will have noticed. There are a few reasons. My dad passed away earlier this year, and then right afterwards I had to fly to Armenia to get facial feminization surgery, and I had a few other things going on at the same time, so it's been extremely hectic. And in the time that I haven't been able to release anything, my Patreon has dropped about $1,000 in support, so it's been really stressful on top of that. But it feels extremely good to get back to working on projects that I really like, and I'm going to try making some more faster videos that I give to Lily to edit, like my recent pathologic essay, and focus my own personal efforts on the bigger work that I find more meaningful, like Monster Men. Speaking of Monster Men, because it's a media analysis series, I can absolutely never get a single episode monetized on YouTube, so if you want to make more Monster Men happen, please go to my Patreon at patreon.com/SophieFromMars, and if you want to see videos early, you can give me $2. Or more than $2. As ever, I'd love if people checked out my weekly commie roundtable discussion show, Red Planet, every Sunday from 8 PM to 11 PM UK time. Link in the description. We always have really interesting based guests who are engaging in forms of mutual aid and direct action like Just Stop Oil or Palestine Action. Just incredible people, and the discussions we have honestly make my day every single time. Like I said, I'm actually going to miss talking about giants quite a lot, but I think it's had a big effect on the projects that I have coming up. I have something about climate change up next called The World Is Not Ending, and I have some more conceptual stuff that really relies on hyperobject philosophy in the works as well. So I guess shout out to Dr. Morton as well for all their work. It really means a lot to me that people support me to talk about media and politics and philosophy in the way that they do, and I want to do the best and most useful and helpful, not to mention entertaining, things that I can with that honor. So thanks again to all my patrons, and I'll see you in future episodes. The next one is about one specific character who has influenced monster storytelling a really strange amount, and how he's gay and I love him. Okay, bye for now.